Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight we're diving into one of World War II's most bizarre classified programs. A project so strange that when it was finally declassified, people thought it was an elaborate hoax. Picture this. You're a pigeon, pecking at seeds in a city square, completely unaware that halfway across the world, scientists are training your cousins to become living guidance systems for missiles. And here's the reality check. If you were a pigeon in 1943, you had about as much chance of becoming a kamikaze pilot as you did of surviving the winter in war-torn Europe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. All right. Let's begin the story. You find yourself standing on the deck of a merchant ship in the North Atlantic. March 1943. The steel beneath your feet vibrates with the constant thrum of engines pushing through choppy waters. Salt spray stings your face as you scan the horizon, knowing that somewhere out there, Nazi U-boats prowl like mechanical sharks. The convoy system is supposed to protect ships like yours, but the statistics tell a different story. Last month alone, the Wolfpack sent 120 Allied vessels to the ocean floor. You grip the railing tighter as you remember that most sailors don't survive more than 4 minutes in these freezing waters. The traditional weapons aren't working. Depth charges require you to be directly above a submarine. Good luck with that when they can dive to 700 feet. Historians still argue whether the Allies truly grasped how close they came to losing the Battle of the Atlantic in early 1943. Your ship's gunners practice daily, but hitting a periscope at 500 yards from a rolling deck, you might as well be throwing darts blindfolded after 3 shots of whiskey. Back in Washington, military planners spread maps across mahogany tables, their coffee growing cold as they wrestle with an impossible equation. How do you hit a target you can barely see, from a platform that won't stop moving, with technology that belongs in the last war? The mainstream historical fact everyone knows is that radar and sonar eventually turn the tide. But here's the quirky tidbit they don't teach in school. Some of America's brightest minds were about to propose weaponizing the one thing nobody expected: the common city pigeon. You wouldn't believe the classified memos flying between the Pentagon and research facilities. Scientists are pitching everything from trained dolphins to literal bat bombs. Yes, that was real. And yes, it went exactly as badly as you're imagining. The military's favorite phrase becomes, unconventional solutions for unconventional warfare. One admiral reportedly quipped that they'd train goldfish if someone could prove they could steer a torpedo. The year shifts to late 1943, and you're walking through the University of Minnesota's psychology department, where the radiators clank like tired ghosts and the hallways smell of floor wax and academic desperation. Behind one unremarkable door, you'd find a man who looks more like your neighbor's accountant than a military weapons designer. B.F. Skinner adjusts his round spectacles and watches a pigeon peck at a colored disc, with the intensity of a chess grandmaster studying his next move. You'd never guess this mild-mannered professor is about to pitch the military on using birds as missile guidance systems. Skinner's reputation precedes him like a strange perfume. Brilliant, but unsettling. You've heard the stories circulating through academic circles. He keeps his infant daughter in a temperature-controlled box, though he insists it's just a fancy crib. He can make pigeons play ping-pong, and he believes free will is an illusion we tell ourselves between stimulus and response. The mainstream historical fact is that Skinner pioneered operant conditioning, revolutionizing behavioral psychology. The quirky tidbit? He once tried to teach pigeons to communicate using a symbolic language, and they actually started creating their own words for concepts he hadn't taught them. You watch him work with his birds, and there's something hypnotic about it. He doesn't speak to them or coo like you'd expect from someone who spends 12 hours a day with pigeons. Instead, he operates a small device that delivers precisely measured food pellets at exact intervals. Click, peck, reward. Click, peck, reward. The pigeons bob their heads with metronomic precision, their beady eyes focused on targets with an intensity that makes you uncomfortable. One bird, which Skinner has named Bertrand after the philosopher, can allegedly discriminate between 47 different visual patterns. The idea strikes Skinner during a train ride to Washington, or so he'll claim in his memoirs. Historians still argue whether this eureka moment was real or carefully constructed mythology. He's watching the landscape blur past when he realizes that guiding a missile is fundamentally a discrimination task. See target, adjust direction, maintain course. His pigeons already do this thousands of times during feeding. What if, instead of pecking for corn, they could peck to steer a bomb? You're present when Skinner first floats this concept to his colleagues. The room falls silent, except for the gurgle of the coffee percolator. One professor literally spits out his drink, not dramatically, just a surprised little spray that he quickly wipes with his sleeve. Burrus, someone finally says, using Skinner's first name like a disappointed parent. Are you seriously suggesting we strap pigeons into missiles? Skinner's response becomes legendary in the department. Would you prefer we keep strapping 18-year-old boys into bombers? The psychology department becomes a peculiar war zone of its own. Traditional behaviorists think Skinner has lost his mind, while his graduate students work overtime building elaborate training apparatus from salvaged parts. You help construct a mock cockpit from a discarded icebox, complete with a tiny window and a tilting platform that simulates aerial movement. The first pigeon to try it promptly defecates on the controls and refuses to cooperate for 3 days. Skinner simply makes a note. Subject 1 displays resistance to novel environments. Increase habituation period. You're crouched in Skinner's laboratory at 3 a.m., watching a pigeon navigate a maze of mirrors and lights with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. The bird tilts its head, processing visual information at speeds that make your human brain feel like outdated hardware. What you're witnessing challenges everything you thought you knew. Now about these birds that most people dismiss as rats with wings. The coffee in your mug has gone cold hours ago, but you can't look away as test subject number 23, nicknamed Amelia by a romantically inclined graduate student, successfully identifies a ship silhouette from 32 different angles without a single error. The science behind pigeon vision reads like something from a superhero origin story. These birds see ultraviolet light, detect magnetic fields, and process visual information at roughly 100 frames per second compared to your measly 24. When you look at a distant ship, you see a grey blob. When a pigeon looks at the same ship, it sees individual rivets, rust patterns, and can probably tell you what the cook had for breakfast. The mainstream historical fact is that pigeons have been used for communication since ancient Egypt. The quirky tidbit that makes military officials sit up straight. Racing pigeons can maintain focus on a single visual target for over 6 hours without fatigue, longer than most human pilots can fly without amphetamines. You help Skinner run discrimination tests that would make a computer programmer weep. Pigeons learn to distinguish between friendly and enemy vessels using photographs so grainy they look like television static. One bird, a particularly clever specimen named Tesla, figures out how to identify submarines by their wake patterns alone. When you mention this seems impossible, Skinner shows you high-speed footage of Tesla's eye movements. The bird isn't just looking, it's calculating angles, comparing patterns, running some kind of biological algorithm that MIT engineers would kill to understand. The training methodology evolves from simple pecking to complex navigation tasks. You watch pigeons learn to steer by pecking at different quadrants of a screen, their movements translating into directional commands. Left peck means turn left. Right peck means turn right. Center peck means full speed ahead into whatever you're aiming at. It's disturbingly similar to modern video games, except these players are working for birdseed and their high score involves hypothetical explosions. Historians still argue whether Skinner's pigeons were truly thinking or just following elaborate stimulus response patterns. But watching them work, you'd swear they understand their mission. The military liaison assigned to evaluate the project, a major who insists everyone call him just Tom, arrives skeptical and leaves converted. You observe his transformation from eye-rolling cynic to evangelical supporter over the course of a single afternoon. It happens when Amelia successfully guides a simulated missile through a complex course, while Tom tries the same task on a parallel setup. The pigeon beats his time by 43 seconds. "Christ on a cracker," Tom mutters, which is apparently how majors express scientific admiration. The bird's actually better than our electronic systems. You're taking notes when Skinner drops his biggest revelation. Pigeons can be trained to recognize specific ships, not just ship types. He shows you footage of a bird identifying the Bismarck from dozens of other battleships, pecking frantically only when that specific vessel appears. The implications make your spine tingle. These aren't just guided missiles anymore. They're assassins with feathers, capable of hunting individual targets across an entire ocean. The abandoned bowling alley on the outskirts of Minneapolis doesn't look like much from the outside. Peeling paint, boarded windows, and a sign that still advertises League Night Thursdays to ghosts. But you push through the heavy door and enter what might be the strangest laboratory in military history, where pins once crashed. Elaborate mechanical devices now whir and click. The old ball returns have been converted into pigeon highways, and in Lane 7, you spot what appears to be a miniature aircraft cockpit built for a very small, very feathered pilot. You help graduate students wrestle with projectors salvaged from closed movie theaters, trying to create the world's first flight simulator for birds. The smell of machine oil mingles with birdseed and cigarette smoke as everyone works through another all-nighter. The technical challenges feel insurmountable. How do you create a viewing screen that matches a pigeon's field of vision? Their eyes sit on the sides of their heads, giving them nearly 360-degree sight, which is fantastic for spotting predators but complicates your missile guidance system. One exhausted engineer suggests using a fishbowl after 12 hours without sleep. This actually seems reasonable. The breakthrough comes when someone raids the university's ophthalmology department. You watch them return with armfuls of lenses, prisms, and optical equipment that probably cost more than your annual salary, within days. The team creates a 3-panel display system that curves around the pigeon's position, projecting target images that scroll and zoom based on pecking inputs. It looks like something Jules Verne would design if he'd been really into birds and military hardware. The mainstream historical fact is that flight simulators were already being used to train human pilots. The quirky tidbit: Skinner's pigeon simulators were more advanced than many human versions, incorporating real-time response to control inputs when most military simulators still use static images. You're assigned to help build the actual missile guidance chambers, tiny cockpits that will fit inside the nose cones of glide bombs. The specifications read like a fever dream. Must accommodate 3 pigeons for redundancy, include individual viewing screens, maintain stable temperature at 20,000 feet, and somehow translate pecking into mechanical control surface movements. Oh, and it needs to be disposable, because, let's not sugarcoat this, it's a one-way trip for our feathered pilots. Historians still argue whether using 3 pigeons was Skinner's idea or military paranoia, but the concept is disturbingly elegant. Majority rules democracy, even in a kamikaze missile. The first prototype looks like a pressure cooker, had a baby with a telescope. You help install tiny seats, modified from dollhouse furniture, miniature screens, repurposed from submarine periscopes, and a pecking interface that would make Rube Goldberg proud. Each peck moves a small metal plate, which shifts a series of pulleys, which adjust control cables, which theoretically steer the missile. During the first test, Pigeon number 1 pecks so enthusiastically it breaks the mechanism. Pigeon number 2 falls asleep. Pigeon number 3 somehow escapes and is found 2 hours later in the women's bathroom, leading to the day's only moment of levity when a secretary screams and throws her compact at it. By month's end, you've got a working chamber that can fit in a standard AN M65 bomb casing. The pigeons seem to enjoy their custom cockpits, which disturbs you more than it should. One bird, a particularly aggressive male named Patton, pecks with such precision and determination that he can keep a simulated missile on target through wind shear, cloud cover, and even while the graduate students shake the entire apparatus to simulate anti-aircraft fire. The morning starts with you feeding dead beetles to pigeons, which isn't exactly what you imagined when you signed up for classified military research. But these aren't ordinary beetles. They're painted with ship silhouettes, and the pigeons need to learn that pecking at the sweet spot, usually the ammunition storage or fuel tanks, delivers the biggest reward. You watch Amelia delicately tap the exact center of a miniature Yamato battleship painted on a beetle's carapace, and somewhere in your brain, the absurdity of this moment battles with its terrible genius. Skinner's training regime has evolved into something that would make Olympic coaches jealous. Each pigeon undergoes a 6-week program that starts with simple target recognition and escalates to what you can only describe as aerial combat doctorate studies. You track their progress on charts that wouldn't look out of place in a Fortune 500 boardroom. Performance metrics, success rates, reaction times. One bird named Eisenhower, the lab has developed a thing for military names, shows a 97% accuracy rate in rough weather simulations. That's better than most human bombardiers achieve on their best days. The breakthrough moment arrives on a Tuesday that smells like rain and nervous sweat. You're running standard trials when Patton does something unprecedented. He begins anticipating target movement. The projection shows a destroyer beginning evasive maneuvers, and instead of pecking where the ship is, Patton pecks where it's going to be. The room goes silent, except for the whir of projectors and Skinner's sharp intake of breath. "Did that bird just calculate a leading shot?" someone whispers. The mainstream historical fact is that predictive targeting was one of the great challenges of World War II naval combat. The quirky tidbit: Patton the Pigeon solved it in 12 seconds using a brain the size of a shelled walnut. You help design increasingly sadistic training scenarios. Ships hide behind smoke screens. The pigeons learn to track wake patterns. Targets appear at oblique angles. they develop a preference for attacking from above, like actual dive bombers. Multiple vessels cluster together. The birds learn to identify and prioritize high-value targets. One particularly clever pigeon figures out that aircraft carriers are usually in the center of formations and develops a strategy of pecking through escorts to reach them. Historians still argue whether this represents true tactical thinking or incredibly sophisticated pattern recognition. But watching it happen makes your neck hair stand up. The most unsettling part comes when you realize the pigeons are enjoying themselves. They compete for simulator time, shouldering each other out of the way like feathered fighter jocks. Amelia develops a rivalry with a newcomer named MacArthur that results in actual aerial combat when they're let out for exercise, diving, wheeling, practicing maneuvers they've learned from the simulations. You mentioned to Skinner that the birds seem to be developing personalities. He responds with a thin smile. Personality is just behavior we haven't quantified yet. The training reaches its culmination with live ordnance tests, thankfully, without actual explosives. You watch from a bunker as pigeons guide weighted dummy bombs toward floating targets in a Minnesota quarry lake. The success rate hovers around 85%, which sounds impressive until you remember that missing 15% of the time means sending 1,000-pound bombs into random civilians. But then Patton takes his turn, diving through simulated flak, essentially a graduate student throwing handfuls of confetti, and plants his dummy bomb so perfectly on target that the floating platform actually sinks. Everyone cheers, then falls silent, realizing what we're actually celebrating. You're stuffed into a Pentagon conference room that smells like stale cigars and skepticism, watching Skinner set up his demonstration equipment while generals exchange glances that clearly say, "What fresh hell is this?" The brass arranged in their seats looks like a Mount Rushmore of military disapproval, jaw lines that could cut glass and eyebrows permanently fixed in positions of doubt. General Morrison, whose chest carries enough medals to stock a craft store, leans over to Admiral Chen and stage whispers, "If this works, I'll eat my hat." You make a mental note to hold him to that. Skinner, bless his academic heart, opens with a 20-minute presentation on operant conditioning that has two colonels actually nodding off. You can see Major Tom, your inside ally, frantically gesturing for him to skip to the good stuff. The room temperature seems to drop another degree with each mention of reinforcement schedules and discriminative stimuli. One general starts doodling battleships on his notepad, unaware that he's about to see those same ships through a pigeon's eyes. The mainstream historical fact is that military procurement in 1944 was notoriously conservative. The quirky tidbit? The same generals rejecting pigeon guidance had just approved a project to train bats to carry incendiary bombs. Apparently, mammals were more respectable than birds. Finally, mercifully, Skinner wheels in the demonstration unit. It looks like a carnival fortune-telling booth had aggressive sex with a bomb casing. 3 windows reveal 3 pigeons, Patton, Amelia, and a new recruit named Nimitz, already focused on their screens with the intensity of submarine sonar operators. The generals lean forward despite themselves. You start the projector, showing footage of an enemy destroyer filmed from a dive bomber's perspective. The room fills with the click, click, click of pecking as the pigeons begin their work. What happens next makes you believe in magic, or at least in the power of behavioral psychology. The 3 pigeons, working independently, guide the simulated missile with uncanny precision. On the wall-mounted display, you watch trajectory lines converge on the destroyer's ammunition magazine. The pecking reaches a crescendo as the missile closes in, and then Impact. Dead center. The room is so quiet, you can hear Admiral Chen's pocket watch ticking. General Morrison's hat remains unfortunately uneaten, but his mouth hangs open like a landed fish. Run it again, Morrison barks. And you do, this time with a submarine, then a carrier, then multiple targets with defensive maneuvers. The Pigeons nail every single one. Nimitz even shows off, guiding his missile through a gap between two friendly ships to reach an enemy vessel hiding behind them. Major Tom can't suppress a grin as he notes, "Gentlemen, these birds just outperformed our best bombardier's annual accuracy rates in under 15 minutes." Historians still argue whether the generals were more impressed by the accuracy or horrified by the implications, but their faces suggest both emotions were wrestling for dominance. The questions come fast and sharp like anti-aircraft fire. What about weather? The Pigeons train in artificial fog and rain. What about G-forces? Tests show they handle up to 5 Gs better than humans. What about... General Morrison pauses, searching for objections. Morale? You're asking American boys to load birds into bombs? Skinner's response enters military legend. Sir, we're already asking American boys to be the bombs. I'm trying to send pigeons instead. The room goes quiet again, but it's a different kind of silence. The kind that sounds like minds changing. You're elbow deep in pigeon droppings and precision engineering, trying to solve problems that would make Rube Goldberg weep into his breakfast cereal. The technical challenge of the day, designing a waste management system for kamikaze pigeons. Yes, this is your life now. The birds need to stay focused during a 15-minute terminal dive. But as you've learned, nervous pigeons have remarkably active digestive systems. One test flight ended with the guidance system literally covered in shit, a phrase that usually stays metaphorical in military research but became distressingly literal in your case. The personality differences between pigeons prove more challenging than any mechanical issue. You've got detailed psychological profiles that read like demented baseball cards. Pattern: aggressive, highly motivated, tends to overpeck when excited. Amelia: steady, reliable, gets distracted by cloud formations. There's one bird, nicknamed Hamlet, who hesitates before every peck, apparently contemplating the existential weight of his decisions. During one test, Hamlet spent 45 seconds staring at a battleship before finally committing to a targeting solution. By then, the simulated missile had crashed into the ocean. The mainstream historical fact is that World War II saw huge advances in standardization and mass production. The quirky tidbit: every single pigeon guidance system had to be custom calibrated to its pilot's personality, making them more like Swiss watches than assembly line weapons. You develop workarounds that would sound insane in any other context. Patton gets a reinforced pecking screen after he cracks 2 regular ones with his enthusiasm. Amelia's chamber includes tiny side mirrors to minimize her cloud gazing. Hamlet gets pre-flight pep talks, yes, really, and a mild stimulant in his feed that makes him more decisive. One engineer suggests playing music to keep them focused, which leads to the surreal experience of testing whether pigeons perform better to Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman. Answer: they prefer silence, though one bird named Satchmo shows marked improvement with jazz. The mechanical challenges multiply like rabbits in springtime. The pecking interface needs to be sensitive enough to register light taps, but robust enough to survive a bird having what you've termed a targeting tantrum. You're working with jeweler's tools 1 minute and sledgehammers the next. The control cables freeze at high altitudes until someone suggests running them through tubes warmed by the pigeon's body heat. essentially making the birds their own heating system. It works. But now you have to calculate the thermal output of an excited pigeon, which absolutely isn't in any engineering manual. Late one night, you're watching Tesla work through a particularly complex targeting sequence when he does something that makes you question reality. He pecks out a pattern, pauses, then pecks what appears to be a correction. You run it back in slow motion and realize he's compensating for wind drift that hasn't even affected the missile yet. The bird is essentially solving differential equations with his beak. You mention this to Skinner, who simply nods and says, "The organism is always more complex than our models suggest." Historians still argue whether incidents like this represent true cognition or elaborate conditioning. But at 3 a.m., watching a pigeon outperform analog computers, the distinction feels meaningless. The biggest revelation comes when you realize the pigeons are training you as much as you're training them. They've taught the team that morning tests work better, birds are hungrier, that green targets are easier to track than grey ones. Who knew pigeons were slightly colorblind to grey? And that a pigeon named Churchill will only work if his chamber faces east. You've become pigeon psychologists, pigeon engineers, and pigeon whisperers all rolled into one sleep-deprived package. You're seated in a War Department briefing room, watching the most bizarre arms race in military history unfold across a series of charts and projections. Project Pigeon isn't the only game in town anymore. It turns out half of America's scientists have been cooking up guidance systems in their basements like suburban moonshine. There's the radar-guided approach from Western Electric, the television-guided bomb from RCA, and something involving gyroscopes that makes your head spin just reading about it. Each team presents their solution like carnival barkers trying to sell the military on their particular brand of mechanical magic. The Western Electric representative, a thin man who sweats through his shirt despite the Arctic air conditioning, demonstrates a system that costs roughly the same as a small house, per unit. His radar guidance is impressive, until cloud cover rolls in during the demonstration and the missile starts homing in on a nearby water tower. "Minor calibration issue," he insists, while his assistants frantically flip switches. You glance at Skinner's pigeons, who are contentedly pecking at targets through simulated fog, rain, and what one creative graduate student called atmospheric soup. The birds don't care about weather, they just want their corn. Competition breeds innovation, and sometimes pure insanity. You attend a demonstration where inventors pitch ideas that sound like rejected comic book plots. There's a heat-seeking system that unfortunately can't tell the difference between a ship's smokestack and the sun. Several test missiles attempted to fly into space. Someone suggests magnetic guidance, which works great until you realize friendly ships are also made of metal. The mainstream historical fact is that electronic guidance eventually won out. The quirky tidbit: one rejected proposal involved training dolphins to swim underneath enemy ships with explosives. Apparently, the Navy drew the line at maritime mammals, but was still considering birds. The funding battles turn vicious. You're tasked with preparing cost comparisons that read like absurdist poetry. Project Pigeon, $25 per guidance system, including bird, training, and 2 pounds of feed. Western Electric's radar, $2,000 per unit, not including the ground support equipment that costs more than your hometown's annual budget. But the electronics lobby has something Skinner doesn't: the promise of reusable technology. "Gentlemen," one executive smoothly explains, "our systems can be refined, miniaturized, mass-produced. Can you say the same about pigeons?" Skinner's response, "Have you seen how fast pigeons reproduce?" doesn't land well with the brass. Behind closed doors, Major Tom confides that the real issue isn't money or effectiveness, it's credibility. "We're trying to convince Congress to fund the war effort," he explains, lighting his fifth cigarette of the meeting. "How do I tell Senator Johnson from Iowa that we're spending his constituents' tax dollars on bird training?" You want to point out that they're already funding bat bombs and something called Project X-Ray that involves dropping live mice on Japan. But Tom's expression suggests this isn't the time for logic. Historians still argue whether Project Pigeon failed due to technical limitations or simple embarrassment. But watching military bureaucracy in action, you know which way to bet. The turning point comes during a joint demonstration. Skinner's pigeons go head-to-head with the latest electronic guidance system in what amounts to the world's strangest accuracy contest. 10 targets, varying weather conditions, multiple angles of approach. The pigeons nail 9 out of 10. The electronic system manages 6 before suffering what the technicians call a cascade failure, but looks more like an expensive tantrum. Yet, somehow, the electronics team gets increased funding, while Project Pigeon receives what Tom euphemistically calls continued evaluation status. Military speak for, "We're not saying no, but we're not saying yes either." You're standing in the New Mexico desert at dawn, watching tumbleweeds roll past like nervous spectators, while the test range crew sets up what might be the most important, or most ridiculous, demonstration in military history. The heat's already building, and you can see waves shimmering off the packed earth where target ships made of plywood and prayer wait for their fate. Patton, Amelia, and Tesla sit in their miniature cockpits inside 3 separate dummy bombs, probably wondering why their world suddenly smells like creosote and aviation fuel instead of the familiar Minneapolis rain. The first test goes exactly as wrong as you'd expect when combining live animals, experimental explosives, and Murphy's Law. The release mechanism jams, leaving the bomb hanging from the B-25's belly like the world's most dangerous piñata. You watch through binoculars as the bombardier tries everything short of climbing out on the wing to shake it loose. Finally, something gives. Unfortunately, it's the electrical connection to the Pigeon guidance system. The bomb falls like a very expensive rock, missing the target by roughly the distance from here to next Tuesday. Patton's probably in there pecking frantically at a dead screen, which makes you feel worse than it should. Test 2 brings its own special flavor of chaos. Amelia's bomb releases cleanly. The guidance system activates, and for 30 glorious seconds, you watch the trajectory curve toward the target with ballet-like grace. Then a hawk, because of course there's a hawk, spots what it assumes is the world's largest, slowest pigeon and decides to investigate. The bomb begins evasive maneuvers that definitely weren't in the programming. You hear the range safety officer mutter something that would make a sailor blush as Amelia apparently engages in aerial combat while still trying to hit her target. She manages both, though the bomb lands 40 feet off center, and the hawk retreats with what you swear looks like profound confusion. By test 3, everyone's nerves are shot, including the pigeons. Tesla's bomb develops a wobble that the engineers call oscillation, but looks more like mechanical panic. Through the telescope, you can see the control surfaces flapping like a bird trying to remember how to fly. The mainstream historical fact is that early guided weapons often suffered from hunting, overcorrecting around their target. The quirky tidbit: Tesla actually compensates for the mechanical failure, pecking in counter rhythm to stabilize the bomb. It's like watching someone steer a shopping cart with a broken wheel. If the shopping cart was falling at 200 miles per hour, and filled with high explosives. The near disaster comes on test 5. Everything's perfect. Release. Guidance activation. Smooth flight path. Until the bomb decides to target the observation bunker instead of the plywood battleship. You've never seen military personnel move that fast, including one general who proved surprisingly spry for a man who hasn't run since Teddy Roosevelt was president. The bomb pulls up at the last second. Thank you, Nimitz, for your excellent target discrimination, but not before everyone gets a very personal demonstration of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of precision-guided munitions. Historians still argue whether this was a targeting error, or if Nimitz had developed opinions about the brass. But either way, it doesn't help Project Pigeon's reputation. Despite the chaos, or maybe because of it, the tests yield remarkable data. When everything works, which happens about 60% of the time, the Pigeon guidance is devastatingly accurate. You watch Eisenhower guide a bomb through a crosswind that has the range officers recalculating their physics, dropping it so perfectly on target that the plywood carrier actually splits in half. The successful runs achieve a circular error probability of 20 feet, which in 1944 terms is like threading a needle from an airplane. The problem is that 40% failure rate, which includes everything from pigeons getting airsick to one memorable incident where a bird somehow pecks the release mechanism for the emergency parachute, turning a guided bomb into the world's most expensive lawn dart. You find yourself in a windowless room underneath the Pentagon, filing reports that will never see daylight, at least not in your lifetime. The classification stamps on Project Pigeon documents read like increasingly paranoid poetry. Secret, top secret, special access required, and your personal favorite, burn before reading, which someone had to explain was a joke, hopefully. The cover stories distributed to curious personnel range from believable, advanced aerodynamics research to bizarre, patriotic bird relocation program. You've personally told 3 different versions of what you do for a living, none of them remotely true. The security protocols around the project would be comical if they weren't so exhausting. Every pigeon gets a code name, then a code name for the code name. Pattern becomes Asset 47, which becomes Feathered Associate, which someone abbreviates to FA 47, which sounds like a weapon system, which causes confusion when requisition forms get mixed up and you accidentally order 47 rifles instead of birdseed. You spend an entire afternoon explaining to a very concerned quartermaster that no, you're not planning an armed bird uprising. The mainstream historical fact is that World War II saw the birth of modern operational security. The quirky tidbit? Project Pigeon's security was so tight that even other classified projects didn't know about it, leading to awkward moments when different secret animal programs accidentally tried to recruit the same zoologists. The paper trail grows like kudzu in August. Every test flight generates reports that get copied, recopied, and classified at different levels until you have documents talking about the same pigeon in ways that make it sound like 3 different animals. There's the sanitized version for congressional oversight. Animal-assisted navigation shows promise. The technical version for engineers. Subject exhibited 0.3-second response latency to target acquisition. And the real version that stays locked in Skinner's safe. Hamlet finally made up his damn mind and hit something. You become fluent in military euphemism, where catastrophic guidance failure means a pigeon fell asleep. An unplanned trajectory deviation means it spotted something shiny. The cover stories for the research facility get increasingly creative as locals notice the weird deliveries. Why do you need so many pigeons? Racing club. Why the electronic equipment? Timing devices for the races. Why the explosions from the test range? Mining operations are very precise mining operations with birds. The official story changes so often that even you forget which version you're supposed to tell. One grad student accidentally tells a date he works in poultry guidance, which sounds like either the world's most boring job or something deeply suspicious. She doesn't call back. Late-night document sessions reveal the true paranoia of wartime classification. You find memos classifying the pigeon's favorite treats, apparently, knowing that Amelia prefers safflower seeds could compromise national security. There's a heated exchange about whether pigeon droppings from the project require special disposal protocols. Someone suggests burning them, leading to a 3-page report on potential intelligence value of avian waste products that reads like a collaboration between Kafka and Dr. Strangelove. Historians still argue whether such extreme secrecy helped or hindered the project. But you're too busy shredding documents about bird bathroom habits to form an opinion. The most surreal moment comes when you're tasked with creating a continuity plan in case the primary pigeon trainers are compromised. You spend a week writing instructions that read like a demented cookbook. If handler alpha is unavailable, handler beta should approach subject 12, codename Eisenhower, with confidence but not aggression. Offer 2, standard corn kernels while maintaining eye contact. Do not blink first. This establishes dominance. The fact that someone, somewhere, is taking this seriously enough to classify it above atomic weapons research makes you question everything you thought you knew about military priorities. You're sitting in a briefing room that smells like moral uncertainty and stale coffee, watching intelligence officers compare Project Pigeon to reports filtering in from the Pacific Theater. The photographs spread across the table show the aftermath of kamikaze attacks, twisted metal, burning ships, and somewhere in that mechanical carnage, the remains of pilots who turned themselves into guided missiles. The parallel is impossible to ignore. Both systems use living beings as expendable guidance computers. The difference, someone points out with uncomfortable logic, is that the Japanese are using volunteers who write poetry before their deaths, while you're using birds who just want corn. The ethical debates rage through the night like philosophical firefights. One officer, a Jesuit-trained logician who somehow ended up in military intelligence, constructs elaborate arguments about consciousness and moral weight. The pigeon doesn't understand death, he insists, chain smoking through his third pack. The kamikaze pilot writes letters to his mother. But Skinner, when consulted, offers a different view. The pigeon understands exactly what it's trained to understand. Hit the target, get the reward. The fact that there's no reward coming is a betrayal we've chosen not to communicate. The room goes quiet enough to hear the fluorescent lights humming their electric judgment. You discover classified reports comparing the effectiveness of both systems, written in the bloodless language of military analysis. Kamikaze pilots achieve roughly 19% hit rates, though this number comes with asterisks explaining variables like pilot experience, aircraft condition, and what percentage were shot down while screaming about emperor and country. Project Pigeon's test data shows 60% success rates. No poetry required. The mainstream historical fact is that kamikaze attacks sank 34 ships and damaged 368 others. The quirky tidbit that makes everyone uncomfortable. Pigeons show lower stress indicators before their final missions than the human pilots, who often needed sake and amphetamines to climb into their cockpits. The comparison files grow thicker with each Pacific battle. You read accounts of Japanese pilots who turn back, unable to complete their missions. and wonder if Hamlet, the pigeon's hesitation, represents the same fundamental resistance to self-destruction. There's a report about kamikaze pilots who missed their targets and survived, living with shame that seems uniquely human. No one's interviewing the pigeons that miss, obviously. But you've noticed something unsettling. Birds that fail their targeting tests seem perfectly happy to try again. They don't understand failure as anything more than a delayed dinner. Late one evening, Major Tom shares intelligence about Japanese training methods that makes your skin crawl. They use similar behavioral conditioning, repetition, reward, group pressure, but applied to humans. We're doing the same thing, he says, gesturing at the pigeon training protocols, just being more honest about it. You want to argue, but then remember Patton pecking enthusiastically at battleship silhouettes, and wonder if enthusiasm without understanding is more or less ethical than understanding without enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether Project Pigeon represented American pragmatism or a moral line that shouldn't have been approached. But watching military ethics bend like heated metal, you realize the question itself might be the only answer. The final report in the comparison file contains a detail that haunts your dreams. Japanese commanders often selected their best pilots for kamikaze missions, while Project Pigeon specifically chooses the most talented birds. Both systems sacrifice excellence in the name of accuracy. You think about Tesla calculating wind drift and Amelia's perfect target discrimination. Talents that would be erased in a flash of impact. The ethical weight feels different when you phrase it as wasting potential rather than taking lives. But the equation balances to the same tragic sum. You're watching the future arrive in boxes marked fragile electronic equipment, while Patton pecks futilely at a target that will never explode beneath him. The year has turned to 1944, and the miracle of miniaturized electronics spreads across your workbench like silicon prophecy. Transistors, tiny crystals that somehow think faster than pigeons, arrive from Bell Labs with instruction manuals thicker than phone books. Each one costs more than training 100 birds. But they don't need corn, don't get airsick, and most importantly, don't make generals uncomfortable about the morality of warfare. The demonstration that kills Project Pigeon happens on a Tuesday that smells like ozone and defeat. Western Electric's new radar-guided system, now debugged and weatherproofed, goes head-to-head with your best birds in what everyone knows is less competition than funeral. The electronic system tracks targets through fog so thick you can't see your hand. It adjusts for wind, compensates for evasive maneuvers, and lands 10 out of 10 bombs within a 30-foot circle. When it's the pigeon's turn, Amelia performs flawlessly, but her 8 out of 10 success rate feels like watching a master calligrapher compete with a printing press. The future has arrived, and it runs on electricity instead of birdseed. You help pack up the equipment while Skinner maintains the cheerful demeanor of a man who's just watched his children lose a spelling bee to a dictionary. The organisms performed admirably, he says, making notes about response latencies while technicians dismantle the pigeon simulators. The mainstream historical fact is that electronic guidance systems revolutionized warfare, making precision bombing possible on a mass scale. The quirky tidbit that no one mentions in the official histories. The early electronic systems had a higher failure rate than pigeons for their first 6 months of deployment. But by then, the birds were already back in their coops. The bureaucratic assassination of Project Pigeon unfolds in memos typed on carbon paper. Redirecting resources to more promising technologies, reads one. Exploring alternative applications for behavioral research, suggests another. Your favorite uses the phrase, sunsetting the Avian Guidance Initiative, which makes it sound like the Pigeons are retiring to Florida rather than being unceremoniously dumped back into civilian life. You're assigned to write the final report, a document that must somehow explain spending 2 years and countless dollars teaching pigeons to guide bombs without making everyone involved look completely insane. In the project's final days, you witness something that perfectly captures the absurd tragedy of it all. A new technician, unaware the program is ending, excitedly shows off a breakthrough. He's trained a pigeon to recognize ship types by their radar signatures, essentially teaching a bird to see like the electronic systems that are replacing it. The pigeon, a young female named Rosie, after the riveter, can identify vessels through electronic noise that looks like static to human eyes. It's a fusion of biological and electronic warfare that arrives precisely too late to matter. Historians still argue whether this represented a missed opportunity or merely the last gasp of an obsolete idea. But watching Rosie peck at radar signatures with laser precision, you can't help but mourn the future that might have been. The final shutdown order comes wrapped in enough classification stamps to wallpaper a small room. You're instructed to maintain all research materials for potential future applications, while simultaneously told to cease all activities immediately. It's the military equivalent of keeping your ex's photos while insisting you've moved on. The pigeons are redistributed to universities and racing clubs, their military careers erased from their records like secret agents returning to civilian cover. Patton goes to a breeding program in Iowa, Amelia to a psychology lab at Harvard, and Tesla simply disappears into the classification system, his fate redacted in black ink. You're nursing a Manhattan in 1960 when the news breaks, 16 years after you signed enough secrecy oaths to paper a battleship. The headline in the Times reads, "Pigeons almost guided U.S. bombs in Wuhan," and your bartender jokes about birds with bloodlust while you try not to choke on your cherry. The declassification comes without warning. One day, Project Pigeon is a secret you'll take to your grave. The next, it's water cooler conversation across America. Your phone rings off the hook with reporters who can't decide if this is the greatest story of military innovation or the stupidest thing they've ever heard. The public reaction splits like a personality disorder. Half the country laughs until their sides hurt. Editorial cartoonists drawing pigeons in tiny pilot helmets, saluting the flag. The other half gets genuinely angry about government waste, writing letters to Congress demanding to know why their tax dollars went to bird brain schemes while brave boys died overseas. You watch Skinner on television, still defending his work with the patience of a saint explaining physics to flat earthers. The pigeons performed exactly as designed, he insists to a host who can't stop giggling. The only failure was in human imagination. The mainstream historical fact is that military projects routinely stay classified for decades. The quirky tidbit: 3 former Project Pigeon birds were still alive when the story broke, living in a New York loft and presumably wondering why reporters suddenly cared about their military service. The conspiracy theories bloom like mushrooms after rain. Someone claims the program never really ended, that the government maintains secret flocks of attack pigeons in underground bunkers. A grainy photograph surfaces purporting to show missile pigeons at Area 51, though you recognize it as Tesla in his training cage from 1944. Your favorite theory suggests Project Pigeon succeeded too well, that pigeon-guided missiles were used in Korea and Vietnam, but covered up to protect the secret. You contemplate writing to correct them, but realize the truth, that bureaucracy and embarrassment killed the project, is somehow less believable than shadow government bird armies. Veterans of the project emerge from classification purgatory with stories that sound like bar tales told by unreliable drunks. The engineer who designed the pecking mechanism becomes a minor celebrity on the dinner party circuit. "You should have seen their little faces," he tells rapt audiences. "So focused, so determined. Better soldiers than half the recruits." The graduate student, who named all the birds after military leaders, publishes a memoir called Patton Had Feathers that sells surprisingly well. Everyone who touched the project seems eager to claim their piece of absurdist history, except for the ones who spent 16 years perfecting their cover stories and can't quite let go. You attend a reunion that Skinner organizes at the old bowling alley, now a shopping complex selling things that would mystify a 1944 Pigeon. Former technicians, engineers, and bird trainers gather like veterans of a war nobody else fought. Someone brings a pigeon, not one of the originals, but a descendant of Amelia, and everyone takes turns holding it, remembering. The conversation flows between technical specifications and bird personalities, between what-ifs and thank gods. Historians still argue whether Project Pigeon represented American ingenuity or desperation, but standing in what used to be Lane 7, surrounded by people who taught pigeons to fly bombs, the distinction feels less important than the shared absurdity. The most surreal moment comes when you meet a Japanese engineer who worked on kamikaze planes. He's studying the declassified documents with fascination. "We turn men into missiles," he says quietly, holding a photo of Patton in his cockpit. "You try to save them with birds." There's no judgment in his voice, just a kind of wondering sadness. You buy him a drink and spend the evening comparing notes on guidance systems and moral compromises. Two old men bound by the strange brotherhood of people who've weaponized the living. You're walking through a naval research facility in 1962, watching dolphins leap through hoops that look suspiciously like mine detection patterns. When you realize Project Pigeon never really died, it just evolved and went swimming. The trainer, an earnest young woman who reminds you of the graduate students from Minneapolis, explains how the dolphins can identify underwater mines by echolocation. "They're remarkably intelligent," she gushes, and you bite your tongue to keep from saying, "So were the pigeons." The military apparently decided that marine mammals were more dignified than birds, though you fail to see how strapping bombs to Flipper represents a moral upgrade from Patton the pigeon. The classified files you still have access to reveal a whole menagerie of military animals inspired by Skinner's work. There's Project X-Ray, the bat bomb initiative that actually predated the pigeons, but borrowed heavily from operant conditioning research. Someone thought releasing bomb-carrying bats over Japanese cities would be more humane than conventional bombing, until the test bat set fire to a New Mexico airbase, and the project died in a blaze of bureaucratic embarrassment. The mainstream historical fact is that military animal programs continued through Vietnam and beyond. The quirky tidbit that makes you laugh. The Navy spent $3 million training dolphins to guard nuclear submarines before realizing the dolphins kept swimming off to play with wild pods. You meet researchers working on something called cyborg insects, beetles with electrodes controlling their flight patterns. It's Project Pigeon meets science fiction, and watching a rhinoceros beetle navigate an obstacle course makes you nostalgic for the simple days of pecking and corn rewards. The beauty is they're disposable, one scientist explains, apparently missing the ethical lessons of 1944. The technology has advanced, but the fundamental question remains: how do we create guided weapons that think without creating thinking beings we send to die? Historians still argue whether biomimetic weapons represent progress or merely sophisticated cruelty, but watching that beetle turn left on command, you recognize Skinner's ghost in the machinery. The Vietnam War brings disturbing echoes of your Pigeon days. You read reports of surveillance dogs and mine-detecting rats with the same queasy recognition of lives transformed into instruments. One project attempts to use pigeons as living cameras, strapping tiny transmitters to birds and releasing them over enemy territory. It fails when the pigeons, sensibly, fly home instead of loitering over Viet Cong positions. You want to tell them about Amelia's cloud-gazing habits, how even the best-trained bird maintains its nature. But your clearance expired years ago, and nobody asked the old-timers anyway. Private companies court you for consultation, waving checks and asking about biological guidance systems with the enthusiasm of people who've never watched a pigeon miss its target because it spotted a French fry. You decline politely, then less politely when they persist. One executive actually suggests reviving Project Pigeon with modern electronics, hybrid biological digital systems, he calls it, apparently unaware he's describing a nightmare. You tell him about Hamlet's existential pecking delays and Tesla's mechanical poetry, trying to convey that consciousness isn't a design specification you can optimize. The darkest moment comes when you learn about dolphin suicide missions proposed for harbor defense. The plan? Train dolphins to ram enemy divers with explosive harnesses. It's Project Pigeon in the water. Except dolphins definitely understand death, form complex social bonds, and mourn their dead. You write a letter to the program director, breaking 16 years of silence about your work. We convinced ourselves pigeons were just feathered machines. You write, don't make the same mistake with animals that have names for each other. You never receive a reply, but the program quietly shifts to non-lethal applications. You're sitting in your study in 1985, holding a faded photograph of Patton in his miniature cockpit, when your granddaughter asks why you keep pictures of pigeons next to your war medals. How do you explain that these birds taught you more about warfare, ethics, and human nature than any battlefield? You tell her about the summer of 1944, when America's best minds tried to solve warfare with behavioral psychology and birdseed, and watch her eyes widen with the disbelief that only children and historians can muster. Did it work, Grandpa? She asks. And you realize that's the question you've been trying to answer for 40 years. The legacy of Project Pigeon spreads through history like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Skinner's operant conditioning becomes the foundation for everything from teaching disabled children to training search and rescue dogs. The same principles that taught Amelia to guide missiles now help autism therapists reach nonverbal kids. You wonder if she would appreciate the irony, her military failure becoming civilian salvation. The mainstream historical fact is that Skinner became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. The quirky tidbit? He never stopped defending the Pigeon Project, calling it his most elegant demonstration of behavioral control until his death in 1990. You trace the technological lineage from pecking pigeons to modern drones. The Predator unmanned aircraft uses cameras and remote operators instead of birds. But the fundamental concept, a disposable guidance system for precision strikes, remains unchanged. The difference is that pushing a button in Nevada to kill someone in Afghanistan feels cleaner than strapping a pigeon into a bomb. Progress, apparently, means increasing the distance between conscience and consequence. When you see footage of drone strikes on the evening news, you think of Tesla anticipating target movement and wonder if artificial intelligence will ever match the terrible creativity of a motivated pigeon. The ethical questions raised by Project Pigeon echo through decades of military innovation. Every autonomous weapon system, every AI targeting algorithm, every debate about machine decision-making in warfare carries the ghost of those Minneapolis pigeons. We've simply replaced the question, should we use animals as weapons, with, should we create machines that think like animals? The answer seems to depend on whether the machine has feathers. Historians still argue whether Project Pigeon represented a moral watershed or just another Tuesday in humanity's long history of creative destruction. But you know the truth. It was both. You donate your Project Pigeon archives to a military museum, boxes full of training protocols, test results, and photographs of birds that almost changed warfare. The curator, a young man who wasn't alive when pigeons were anything but park nuisances, handles the materials like religious artifacts. It's hard to believe this almost happened, he says, and you resist the urge to correct him. It did happen, for 2 years, in bowling alleys and Pentagon briefing rooms, in New Mexico test ranges and classified laboratories. America seriously pursued pigeon-guided weapons. The fact that they weren't deployed doesn't make the story less real, just less bloody. In your final years, you develop a habit of feeding pigeons in the park, watching them peck at breadcrumbs with the same focused intensity their predecessors brought to ship silhouettes. Sometimes tourists assume you're just another lonely old man with too much time and stale bread. They don't notice how you observe the birds' behavior patterns, their individual personalities, their surprising intelligence. One pigeon, bolder than the rest, learns to eat from your hand. You name him George, after Patton, and tell him stories about his ancestors who almost flew into history. He cocks his head and stares with one bright eye, probably hoping for more bread, but looking for all the world like he understands. Maybe he does. After everything you've seen, you've learned not to underestimate pigeons. The last entry in your journal reads, Project Pigeon failed to deliver weapons but succeeded in delivering questions. In trying to make pigeons inhuman, we discovered how human we weren't willing to become. Perhaps that's the real legacy, not the bombs that didn't fall, but the mirror held up to our cleverness. We could teach pigeons to guide missiles. The harder lesson was learning why we shouldn't. You close your eyes and drift back through the decades, past the electronic guidance systems and dolphin programs, past the declassification and disbelief, past the test flights and training montages, all the way back to that first moment when Skinner watched a pigeon peck at a target and saw the future of warfare. It was a future that never quite arrived, thank God, but the journey toward it revealed more about human nature than any successful weapon system ever could. The pigeons taught us that intelligence exists in unexpected places, that consciousness resists easy categorization, and that every living guidance system, whether feathered, finned, or flesh, carries a weight that silicon circuits never will. In the end, Project Pigeon's greatest success was its failure. We proved we could turn birds into weapons. More importantly, we proved we couldn't live with ourselves if we did. Your granddaughter finds you asleep in your chair, the photograph of Patton still in your hand, a slight smile on your face, outside. Pigeons coo on the windowsill, their voices carrying across the evening air like messages from a war that ended before it began. They don't know their history, these descendants of almost weapons, but they live it anyway, free, purposeless, pecking at whatever catches their eye. Perhaps that's the most fitting memorial for Project Pigeon, a sky full of birds that guide nothing but themselves. As you drift deeper into sleep, the hard edges of memory soften into something gentler. The test ranges become meadows. The target ships transform into clouds. And somewhere in that liminal space between history and dream, Patton, Amelia, and Tesla fly free, not toward targets, but toward horizons that never end. The pecking that once meant destruction now sounds like rainfall, like typewriter keys, like all the small, persistent actions that shape a world. Your breathing slows to match their wing beats, and in this quiet moment, the war finally ends, not with explosions or treaties, but with the simple recognition that some victories are found in the battles we choose not to fight. The pigeons knew this all along. Perhaps they were just waiting for us to learn it too. Sleep well. Dear listener, may your dreams be filled with wings that carry hope instead of warheads, and may you wake to a world where the strangest military programs remain nothing more than bedtime stories. Tomorrow brings new challenges, new choices, new chances to decide what we'll ask of the innocent. But tonight, in this gentle space between waking and sleeping, let the pigeons fly free. Let them guide you not to targets, but to that peaceful place where even the most unusual history becomes a lullaby. Rest now. The birds are just birds again. The sky is just the sky, and all the elaborate plans of mice and men and military planners fade into the forgiving darkness. Sweet dreams.